Hello, this is Marcos Patchett, the Nocturnal Herbalist, and in this video, the third video in my series on social isolation and loneliness and health, I'll be talking about how social isolation and loneliness actually cause the mental and physical health problems I've discussed in my previous videos on this topic. So basically this boils down to a prolonged stress response, a prolonged fight or flight response with increased adrenaline, the rapid response, and increased levels of cortisol, in combination with the physical inactivity which tends to accompany social isolation. Because if you think about it, an animal which is socially isolated doesn't have the support of the rest of its group, doesn't have anyone in its social environment it can rely on, has to be more vigilant. Like the animal that's separated from the pack has to be aware of predators. It can't relax as much, and it's exactly the same for humans. We have the same basic primal programming, so that when we are isolated from people, even if on an individual personality level we may feel less anxious that way because perhaps our experiences have led us to feel more anxious around people, our basic physiology responds by keeping us on a slightly higher, a constantly slightly elevated stress footing, a vigilance footing. We're sort of primed to be aware of potential predators because we can't rely on anyone else looking out for us anymore. So that's the basis of it. So what that leads to, that's the primary issue. The secondary consequences of that, this eventually leads to increased inflammation, especially in blood vessels, and increased oxidative stress. Firstly, the increased level of cortisol or steroids cause some changes in the immune system. Now, under ordinary circumstances, cortisol will suppress inflammation and also suppress specific immunity. So that's like immune responses to viruses and to cancers. And we saw in some of the previous research in earlier videos that social isolation leads to, at least in animal studies, an increased susceptibility to viral infections and an increased risk of developing cancers. This may be why, if cortisol is elevated all the time, it will suppress that specific branch of immunity. It's sometimes referred to as Th1 immunity. I mean, that's a very crude model, but it generally does do that. But the other unfortunate effect of having a background high elevated cortisol is that over time you get what's called glucocorticoid resistance. And this is a little bit similar to what can happen with diabetics, with type 2 diabetes, where if insulin is high all the time, eventually, it's like the postman ringing the doorbell all the time, eventually you ignore the doorbell, the cells stop responding to the cortisol. So what happens is that on white blood cells, a type of white blood cells, leukocytes, you get what's called a conserved transcriptional response to adversity and altered gene expression. So with this cortisol level, stress steroid level maintained high, you get an increased expression of genes which are pro-inflammatory. So these genes which are little material in the center of the cell which code for proteins which do various jobs, these genes which code for inflammatory proteins start to come online, and you get a decreased expression of antiviral proteins like antibodies. So the genes which help produce proteins which protect you against various invaders get switched off. And you also get a reduced production of this general and generic sort of antiviral protein called type 1 interferon. So the consequences of that are increased inflammation, reduced resistance to viruses and other infections, and increased immature inflammatory monocytes. That means these white blood cells, which normally should be patrolling and protecting your system from invaders, they aren't properly able to develop and mature because the genes which code for proteins which would normally signal for that manufacturing maturation process to be completed aren't getting switched on anymore because the immune system begins not responding properly to signals. So this increased level of immature inflammatory monocytes, these adolescent white blood cells, actually make it into the brain, initiate sickness behavior, and actually increase the level of anxiety. So you get this feedback loop, you get this really unfortunate catch-22 cycle where the stress is increased, so cortisol rises, it's prolonged, the doorbell keeps ringing, so some of the white blood cells stop responding to that ringing doorbell, and some of the genes which code for inflammatory proteins come online, some of the genes which code for proteins that are essential for maintaining a healthy immune response go offline. So some of the white blood cells that should be properly matured and fully functional stay stuck in teenage phase, and those immature cells get into the brain, and in the brain they start initiating these inflammatory processes which result in like increased anxiety and sickness behavior, which is not going out, curling up into a ball and not feeling like doing anything, which exacerbates the stress caused by social isolation. Likewise, the researchers have found that loneliness is associated with reduced natural killer cell activity. Natural killer cells are cells in the immune system which attack infected cells. They're part of the primary basic non-specific immune defense. They patrol all the time and they attack any cell that looks abnormal, and they go offline more, and less of them are being produced. It reduces blastogenesis, which means the development and growth of new natural killer cells. The second thing that happens is because of the increased level of adrenaline all the time, adrenaline constricts blood vessels, and at the same time, the resistance to cortisol means that inflammation is going up gradually. So what happens is you get an increase in total peripheral resistance. What that means is that blood pressure is going up because all the little capillaries, the blood vessels, are narrowed because of adrenaline causes that vasoconstriction. Like when you're really stressed, you get clammy, cold hands and feet. That's exactly that. That's adrenaline constricting the blood vessels. And because inflammation is going up, the inflammation in the lining of the blood vessels starts to increase too, which is why you see this appearance of atherosclerosis, the furring up of the blood vessels. That's also down to the fact that cortisol increases the production of sugar and fat. It increases gluconeogenesis, the production of sugar in the liver, and lipogenesis, the production of triglycerides, because normally when you're physiologically stressed, you want ready access to energy. So your liver starts making more sugars and more fats. However, when that's prolonged, the body has to stick all of this somewhere, and if you've got an increased level of inflammation because the cells of the immune system aren't responding to cortisol properly anymore and the level of inflammation is going up, then the inflammation in the lining of blood vessels is going to cause those blood vessel walls to become a little bit scarred. And how is that scarring repaired? Well, some of those fats floating in the bloodstream are used by cells in the linings of blood vessels called foam cells to repair them with basically the biological equivalent of duct tape, which is what we call atherosclerosis. It causes the buildup of these fatty plaques on the linings of blood vessels, which causes them to become narrower. So the blood pressure goes up, and you get this premature stiffening of arteries and blood vessels. And you also get, as a result of the chronic rise in adrenaline, heart rhythm changes with respiration. Normally, when you breathe in and out, the heart rhythm changes slightly. And this is actually a really good indicator of somebody's background stress level, because if somebody's not too stressed all the time, the heart level will change more with respiration, just these slight changes in the rhythm. But the more stressed they are, the less that rhythm changes, so that it's called high frequency heart rate variability. And the reduction in the sensitivity of the heart to normal breathing when you are more stressed is probably because of this higher level of adrenaline, sort of keeping the heart running hot, if you like, at a higher sort of rate and force all the time. So it loses this sensitivity. And what they found is that under normal circumstances, cuddle hormone, oxytocin, which is released by close human contact, will increase that sensitivity of the heart, will restore it to normal sensitivity. But when somebody is socially isolated, oxytocin stops being able to do that. Also, this chronic elevation of stress steroid, of cortisol, causes this enzyme, An enzyme is a substance which catalyzes or facilitates chemical reactions in the brain, or really it's a set of enzymes called NADPH oxidase, sometimes referred to as NOx enzymes for short, which is a great name because NOx is Latin for night and they do bad things, so it's quite good poetically speaking, allegorically anyway. So the elevated level of stress increases the levels of these NOx enzymes in the brain and also in blood vessels, and that increases the level of oxidative stress, the production of free radicals, which I'm not going to explain that again. I've mentioned these in previous videos, but free radicals are kind of like cellular soot. They're waste products of normal cellular metabolism which damage cells. So they increase the level of damage in the brain and in blood vessels. Chronic social isolation reduces the number of receptors on cells in the brain for beta endorphin. That's one of the brain's pleasure chemicals, specifically in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the nucleus accumbens, which are two parts of the brain which, amongst other things, regulate social attachment and social motivation and drive. And the reduction in the number of endorphin or opiate receptors in those areas reduces the amount of reward from social stimulation or social activity, which I did mention in my previous video. So this is the mechanism. There's actually a reduced number of receptors to pleasure producing chemicals in those parts of the brain. So these are some of the effects of social isolation and loneliness. This is how it produces a lot of the mental and physical health issues I've mentioned in previous videos. In my next video, in the fourth video in the series, I'll be talking about what implications these findings have for current social distancing policies. So if you enjoy this kind of content, please give it a thumbs up, please like it, please share it, and please do subscribe, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one. All right, thanks for watching.